What if Princess Diana's own sister just accused the king of murder on camera? In a moment that has shattered royal silence, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's fiercely private sister, has come forward with a bombshell claim. She believes King Charles is responsible for Diana's death. No more whispers. No more theories. Just a direct, haunting accusation that's ignited global outrage and reopened questions the palace hoped were buried. In this investigation, we'll uncover never-before-seen letters, chilling final warnings from Diana herself, and the growing body of evidence that suggests this was never just a tragic accident. The silence is over, and the truth may be darker than we ever imagined. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It began with a silence, the kind that hangs heavy in the air before a storm breaks. For over 2 decades, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Princess Diana's older sister and one of the few people who knew her in every stage of her life, from childhood confidant to global icon, said almost nothing. Through weddings, funerals, controversies, documentaries, and royal reckonings, she stayed quiet. She grieved in private. She smiled when necessary. She honored her sister's legacy with quiet dignity, and the world respected that. But then she spoke, and what she said was not quiet. It was not safe. It was not diplomatic. It was the kind of statement that ruptures foundations, the kind that makes headlines irrelevant and turns speculation into indictment. Lady Sarah did not merely mourn her sister. She accused the King of England of being responsible for her death. She did not flinch. "I believe," she said, "that my sister would still be alive today if it weren't for the choices made by the man who now sits on the throne." In that moment, history shifted. Conspiracy theories that had lived in whispers, in internet forums, in the subtext of countless documentaries, suddenly had a voice. A real one. A name. A face. And not just any face, but one of the few people in the world who had direct access to Diana's unfiltered fears, her private thoughts, her warnings. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a carefully managed media rollout. It was a quiet statement, made in a recorded interview during a documentary project meant to honor Diana's legacy. The filmmaker, reportedly stunned, asked Lady Sarah if she wanted to rephrase or retract. She did not. She looked into the camera, and she held her gaze. Calm, clear, controlled. And yet the tremor those words caused was anything but calm. Within hours, the clip made its way into the public. Then the reaction began. Mainstream media scrambled. Headlines danced between stunned disbelief and cautious framing. Diana's sister makes explosive accusation. Royal insider points finger at King Charles. A family's grief turns political. And online, the story moved faster than facts could catch up. The name Lady Sarah trended on every major platform. Her face, so rarely seen outside of ceremonial functions, was suddenly everywhere. The words she spoke were clipped, subtitled, remixed, and replayed across continents. But the media frenzy was only a symptom. The real shift was emotional. People remembered. They remembered Diana's eyes during her famous interviews, how they darted down when she spoke of betrayal, of loneliness, of being hunted. They remembered her voice breaking as she said there were 3 of us in this marriage. They remembered the photos from Paris, the shattered Mercedes, the confusion, the stillness that followed a life so full of movement. And now, with one accusation, Lady Sarah had torn open a wound the world had only begun to cover. This video is not an opinion piece. It is an investigation. It is a timeline. It is a reckoning. We are going to walk through everything, what Lady Sarah said, why she said it now, and what evidence exists to support or challenge such a monumental claim. We will revisit the final days of Princess Diana, the patterns, the threats, the meetings she had. We will analyze the inconsistencies in official reports and the gaps in palace timelines. We will examine King Charles's actions and movements, his words then and now, and the tension that always seemed to simmer just beneath his public image. We'll hear from legal analysts, psychologists, royal historians, and former staffers, many of whom are breaking silence for the first time in decades. Some call Lady Sarah's words a cry of unresolved grief. Others say she has finally told the truth that others are too afraid to voice. But this isn't just about Charles. This is about the institution he now leads. The firm. The monarchy. The system that Diana said doesn't change, and that Lady Sarah now suggests did more than fail her. It destroyed her. This is not tabloid gossip. This is not an internet rabbit hole. This is one of the most respected members of British aristocracy directly naming the head of state an immoral, if not criminal, accusation. And the question now is, what are we going to do with it? Because once something like this is said, it cannot be unsaid. Once the sister of Diana, the woman whose voice was silenced too soon, whose life became a spectacle, whose death became a turning point, once she speaks, the world has no choice but to listen. We must ask uncomfortable questions. Why did Diana express fear of the palace in her last interviews? Why were there no functioning CCTV cameras where the crash occurred? Why did reports change? Why did investigations stall? Why did so many people, for so long, feel that something wasn't right? And why were they told to stop asking? More importantly, why now? Why has Lady Sarah chosen this moment, 27 years after Diana's death, to speak? Is this about justice? About truth? About legacy? Or is there something deeper, something we haven't seen yet, that has brought her to the edge of silence? We will get into all of that. But first, we must understand what was really said, and the weight of who said it. Lady Sarah is not a political figure. She has no book to sell, no public role to maintain. She has spent her adult life avoiding the spotlight, serving in charitable causes, living quietly in rural England, and guarding her sister's legacy with quiet, unwavering loyalty. So when she speaks, when she breaks that silence, it is not by accident. And if her words are true, then everything we thought we knew about Diana's death is not just incomplete. It's wrong. This video will take you through the fire. From Diana's final hours to the shadows of the palace hallways. From the high-speed crash to the low whispers of betrayal. From the woman who became the world's most beloved figure to the institution that couldn't or wouldn't protect her. This isn't about gossip. This is about history. And history, when spoken by those who lived it, can never be dismissed as fiction. We are here to pull apart the timelines, to hear the voices, to honor the pain, to look into the spaces where truth has been buried and ask, what really happened? And more importantly, who's been protecting the lie? Before we dive into what she said and why it sent shockwaves around the world, we need to understand exactly who Lady Sarah McCorquodale is, not just by title, but by history, personality, and proximity to one of the most famous and tragic figures of the modern age. Because the impact of her statement about Princess Diana's death doesn't come solely from the words she spoke. It comes from who she is, what she's lived through, and why she chose silence for so long. Lady Elizabeth Sarah Lavinia McCorquodale was born on March 19, 1955, the eldest daughter of John Spencer, 8th Earl Spencer, and Frances Shan Kidd. She is the oldest sibling in a line that includes Jane Fellows and Diana, Princess of Wales. As the firstborn daughter, Sarah grew up under the traditional structure and expectations of British aristocracy. Discretion, duty, and emotional restraint were not merely preferred, they were required. Unlike Diana, who would become a global symbol of empathy and rebellion against royal norms, Sarah was raised and remained deeply tied to the codes of the upper class. Loyalty to the crown, protection of family privacy, and avoidance of spectacle. And yet, despite their contrasting roles in history, Sarah and Diana shared one of the most enduring and emotionally complex sibling relationships in the aristocracy. They were not just sisters. They were, at times, rivals, confidants, opposites, and protectors. In fact, long before Diana was in the spotlight, Sarah was the one whose name had briefly touched the royal pages. In the late 1970s, she briefly dated Prince Charles. At the time, she was considered a potential match for the heir to the throne. But their relationship ended abruptly after Sarah reportedly gave an interview to the press where she said she would not marry Charles if he were the dustman or the King of England. The royal family took offense, and Charles cooled on her. That moment, the minor in royal history, began a strange twist of fate. Because a few short years later, Charles would meet and become engaged to her younger sister, Diana. It was Lady Sarah who introduced them. The implications of that introduction would follow her for the rest of her life. On paper, it's a footnote. In reality, it marked the start of a chain of events that would elevate one sister to global prominence and trap the other in a shadow she never intended to create. During Diana's courtship with Charles, Sarah reportedly acted as a supportive observer. Some biographers suggest she encouraged the relationship, unaware of the depth of incompatibility between the two. She remained visible during the wedding, dressed elegantly and standing beside her family as Diana was swept into royal history. But it wasn't until years later, as Diana's marriage began to fall apart and her mental health deteriorated, that Sarah's role shifted from passive sibling to active protector. Though often behind the scenes, Sarah remained one of Diana's most trusted confidants. She visited regularly. She saw the toll the palace life was taking on her sister. And perhaps most importantly, she kept Diana grounded in her roots, away from cameras, away from spin doctors, away from the curated chaos of royal public life. Sarah was not a woman of emotion on display. Unlike Diana, who wore her heart in public and invited the world into her vulnerability, Sarah internalized. She believed in discretion, in boundaries, in private conversations. And because of that, she was the person Diana often turned to when things became too public, too loud, too overwhelming. When Diana and Charles officially separated in 1992, Sarah reportedly helped guide her sister through the private grief. When Diana gave her infamous BBC interview in 1995, some say Sarah was one of the only people who warned her about the potential consequences, not because she disagreed with the content, but because she understood the ruthlessness of the monarchy. By the time of Diana's death in August 1997, Sarah was no longer simply a sister. She was one of the few people who had stood beside Diana in every chapter: childhood, marriage, motherhood, and scandal. When the news broke that Diana had died in a car crash in Paris, Sarah reportedly collapsed in grief. But she didn't speak. She didn't give interviews. She didn't write memoirs. She didn't become a public figure. She became something far more rare in the age of royal spectacle. She became silent. In the days following Diana's death, Sarah accompanied Prince Charles to Paris to retrieve her sister's body. It was a haunting image: the future king and the woman who had once dated him, once introduced him to his future wife, now flying home together with the remains of the woman who had captivated the world. That flight was heavy with contradiction, grief, and unspoken questions. At Diana's funeral, Sarah walked behind the casket alongside her sister Jane, her brother Charles Spencer, and her nephews William and Harry. She didn't speak publicly at the event, but her presence, silent and grief-stricken, stood as a symbol of familial devastation. Following the funeral, Sarah returned to private life. She took on several charity roles in Diana's name, including serving as president of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which operated for years to distribute donations to causes Diana had championed. She helped oversee how Diana's memory was preserved, how the funds were used, and how her sister's humanitarian legacy continued without being turned into a brand or a commodity. She did all of this without seeking recognition, without stepping in front of cameras, without telling her side. But those who knew her said the grief never left, that she carried it with her, not as a burden, but as a sacred duty, a promise to the sister who had suffered too much, too publicly. And for 27 years, she kept that promise. Until now. The timing of Lady Sarah's public statement has stunned not only the royal press, but historians and analysts who had long written her off as a figure of ceremonial significance only. She was seen as part of the quiet Spencer legacy, an aristocratic line that had learned to mourn in private. Her sudden decision to speak, to name King Charles as a key figure in Diana's death, has upended everything. Because Lady Sarah does not speak impulsively. She does not chase headlines. She does not exaggerate. Her words are not meant for drama. They are meant for truth. And the fact that she broke her silence after decades of loyalty means something has changed, either within her or within what she knows. Her character is what gives her words weight. In a world filled with commentators and opportunists, Lady Sarah is an anchor of quiet credibility. Which is why, when she says that Diana feared the institution, that Diana felt hunted, and that Diana would still be alive if not for decisions made by the man now crowned king, the world listens. Because Sarah McCorquodale has never asked to be listened to. She has only ever spoken when it mattered most. And this time, she's not speaking in grief. She's speaking in anger, in warning, in defiance. So the question now becomes, what does she know? There were no press releases, no royal correspondence summoned in advance, no headlines crafted for maximum visibility. Just a single clip, released in the middle of a longer documentary project commemorating the 27th anniversary of Princess Diana's death. The documentary, originally intended to reflect on Diana's humanitarian work and the ongoing influence of her legacy, had already filmed dozens of interviews with former aides, friends, and charity organizers. But it was the sit-down with Lady Sarah McCorquodale that turned the entire project into something else, something explosive. In the footage, Lady Sarah sits in a modest armchair. The backdrop is neutral. There is no grand estate on display, no emblems of aristocratic power behind her. She is dressed simply, the way she has always preferred to present herself. Her hands are still, her voice calm. For nearly 15 minutes, she speaks softly about Diana's childhood. Her laughter, her stubbornness, her sense of mischief. She recalls the way Diana would sneak out of the house to avoid tutors, how she cried watching nature documentaries, how she hated the cold. Then the interviewer asks a question that changes everything. Do you believe the institution, the monarchy, did enough to protect her? There is a pause. A long one. Lady Sarah doesn't blink. No, she replies. I don't. The interviewer waits. Then, do you believe she would still be alive today if she hadn't? Married into the royal family. Another pause. This time, Lady Sarah leans forward slightly. I believe she would still be alive today if it weren't for the choices made by the man who now sits on the throne. No stammering. No qualifiers. No euphemisms. Just clarity. At that moment, the tone of the entire documentary shifts. The crew reportedly went silent. The director, according to internal sources, stopped the cameras and asked Lady Sarah if she wanted to review her statement. She declined. The director asked again, "You're saying King Charles is responsible for her death?" Lady Sarah looked into the camera and said, "That's what I'm saying." In the days that followed the leak of this clip, the documentary's release schedule was thrown into chaos. Networks that had agreed to air the full piece began negotiating which segments could be included. Lawyers were called. One senior executive at a major media group called the footage a cultural nuclear weapon. By the time it reached the public, clipped and shared across social media, the fire had already started, and it would not be put out easily. What's crucial to understand here is not just the content of what Lady Sarah said, but the context. For nearly 3 decades, she had been silent. Not mute, but diplomatically careful. She attended Diana-related events, supported memorial charities, and offered generic reflections when absolutely necessary. But she never spoke publicly about the royal family's role in Diana's life, and especially not in her death. She could have. She was there. She had access to the same corridors, the same rumors, the same whispers behind royal walls that have fueled speculation for years. But she didn't. And for many, her silence was taken as a sign of peace. Acceptance. Closure. Now, all of that is shattered. The public reaction was instant and visceral. Royal watchers across the globe debated the implications. For years, speculation around Diana's death has centered on 3 major theories: negligence, paparazzi pressure, and institutional conspiracy. The third was always the most explosive, the idea that someone inside the monarchy, or with connections to it, facilitated or allowed her death to happen. But with no royal figure ever publicly suggesting such a thing, the theory remained on the fringes. Until now. Lady Sarah's statement dragged the fringe into the center of the conversation. People were no longer asking if something suspicious happened. They were asking how long people inside the palace had known. Television networks held emergency panels. Diana's former bodyguard was interviewed. Former Met Police officials who had investigated the crash were asked to revisit the case. Historians began rewriting chapters in their planned biographies of Charles. Journalists scrambled to contact anyone who had worked closely with Diana in her final weeks. Suddenly, every unanswered question, every discrepancy in the official timeline, every ignored witness, every missing surveillance tape became evidence to be reconsidered. But perhaps most telling was the lack of response from Buckingham Palace. Typically, when a member of the extended Spencer family makes any claim that could harm the monarchy's image, the palace deploys swift, calculated language, dismissals, denials, or the always ambiguous no comment. But this time, there was nothing. Not even a boilerplate statement defending the king's character. Just silence. Some interpreted this as a tactic, a refusal to dignify the claim with a response. But others saw it differently. They saw fear. Because Lady Sarah is not a random commentator or a disgruntled distant cousin. She is Diana's sister. She was inside the circle. Her voice cannot be ignored without consequence. There are reports that senior palace aides immediately convened upon the clip's release. One insider revealed that advisors debated whether the king himself should issue a rebuttal. Another claimed that Camilla was staggered by the statement and furious at the palace's decision not to fight back publicly. William and Harry, for their part, issued no comments. But multiple sources said the statement reopened deep, unresolved tensions between them and the crown. More surprising was the legal conversation the clip sparked. In Britain, Accusing the reigning monarch of being complicit in the death of another royal is no small matter. While it does not automatically trigger legal proceedings, it places pressure on institutions to investigate. Public petitions began circulating, demanding a full reopening of the case. Some called for an independent international inquiry. Others demanded that Parliament issue a formal request for Lady Sarah to testify under oath about what she knows. But no formal actions were taken, not yet. Meanwhile, the press dug deeper. It turned out that the statement was not improvised. The documentary crew revealed that Lady Sarah had prepared notes before the interview, an unusual move for a woman who typically spoke off the cuff. This led some to speculate that the statement was not only deliberate, but coordinated. And that raised another question. Who else knew she was going to say it? Was she encouraged by someone close to her? Was there a final piece of information she had received that prompted her to finally break her silence? Or had she simply reached her limit after years of watching Diana's death treated like a chapter in a story the palace hoped to end? One former family associate offered a chilling possibility. I think Sarah has held on to something for years, something she's never shared. And now, as the years pass, as the players age, as the public starts to forget, maybe she realized that if she didn't say it now, she never would. That possibility. That Lady Sarah's statement is a calculated act of emotional and moral necessity, makes it even more powerful. She is not looking for fame. She is not writing a book. She does not do interviews, which means her decision to speak carries no obvious personal benefit, only risk. But perhaps, to her, the risk of silence had finally become greater than the risk of speaking out. And in speaking out, she has forced the world to look back, not with nostalgia, but with new eyes. Eyes sharpened by time and by truth. The accusation didn't arrive in a dramatic outburst. There were no raised voices, no finger-pointing, no overt declarations of criminal guilt. But its impact was nuclear. It was calm, cold, quiet. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous. I believe my sister would still be alive today if it weren't for the choices made by the man who now sits on the throne. These were the words Lady Sarah McCorquodale uttered. They were measured, intentional, and unmistakably directed at King Charles III. But what exactly did she mean? Did she accuse the king of orchestrating Diana's death? Did she mean emotional neglect? A toxic environment? Indirect complicity? Or was this a direct claim of premeditated action? To answer that, we need to unpack not only the language she used, but the context around it, and the years of unspoken accusations that have long hovered around Charles like smoke around a flame. First, let's return to the language itself. The phrase, choices made, is intentionally ambiguous, but it's not vague. It suggests agency, deliberation, responsibility. Sarah did not say circumstances surrounding the palace. She did not blame the pressures of public life. She didn't cite tragic coincidence. She placed the weight of Diana's fate squarely at the feet of one man, the same man who once promised to honor her, who once vowed to protect her, who now wears the crown. That's not an accident. It's an indictment. To understand the gravity of that statement, we must consider the cultural and constitutional significance of accusing a monarch in the United Kingdom. The royal family sits at the symbolic center of national identity. They are not supposed to be political, personal, or controversial. Their history is filled with quiet scandals, but very few direct challenges from within their own elite circle, especially not from someone like Sarah. A noblewoman from a family whose bloodline predates many monarchs and whose ancestral ties to the Spencers connect her to the core of British aristocracy. When she speaks not as an outsider, but as someone born within the same orbit as the crown itself. And she's not the first to make the claim, but she is the first from inside the family to do so. Over the past 2 decades, numerous theories have circulated about the night of August 31st, 1997. Some allege that the British security services had a hand in Diana's death. Others believe she was being surveilled and was targeted because of fears she would marry Dodi al-Fayed, an Egyptian Muslim, thus exposing her sons, heirs to the throne, to a foreign stepfather. These theories were often dismissed as fringe, fueled by a combination of media hysteria and public grief. Even Mohammed al-Fayed, Dodi's father, made dramatic allegations, claims of royal racism, MI6 involvement, and a deliberate cover-up. But his social and political status meant he was treated with suspicion by the establishment. He was, after all, an outsider. Sarah is not. Her words hold weight not because they introduce a new theory, but because they lend credibility to one the monarchy has spent decades trying to bury. If Lady Sarah meant Charles was directly involved in a conspiracy to eliminate Diana, that would suggest collusion at the highest levels of government and security. But that interpretation may be too narrow. The more probable, and perhaps more damning, interpretation is that she is accusing him of willful negligence. That through his actions, through his decision to push Diana out emotionally, politically, and institutionally, he left her vulnerable, unprotected, isolated. Sarah knew what the world didn't see. She knew the phone calls Diana made in private, the times she cried late into the night, the moments she feared for her safety. She knew that Diana felt hunted, not just by paparazzi, but by something darker, a machinery of silence, of intimidation, of exclusion. And according to people close to her, Sarah never believed Diana was paranoid. She believed she was correct. If Charles was not the architect of Diana's death, he was, in Sarah's eyes, the gatekeeper to the system that drove her there. He had power. He had knowledge. He had choices. And, Sarah suggests, he made the wrong ones. Let's revisit those choices. Choice 1. Marrying Diana knowing full well that he was still in love with Camilla Parker Bowles. This decision set the entire disaster into motion. Diana, only 19 when they married, was thrust into a marriage already rotting at the foundation. Her public image masked a private anguish that Charles failed to address, or worse, dismissed. Choice 2. Continuing the affair with Camilla, even as Diana publicly crumbled. Despite public scrutiny, Charles allowed the affair to persist, showing little regard for how the humiliation affected Diana, their children, or the integrity of the monarchy. Choice 3. Stripping Diana of her security and status following the divorce. After the separation, Diana's protection was drastically reduced. Her royal title was taken, her access to secure transport and advisors limited. Many argue that had she retained royal security on the night of her death, the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel might never have happened. Choice 4. Staying silent for decades. Charles never publicly addressed Diana's death in personal terms. He allowed myths to grow, questions to fester. He never reassured the public that the royal family had done everything it could to support her. He never spoke of her in human terms until it was politically safe to do so. Even in private, according to some accounts, he rarely mentioned her to William and Harry in the years after her death, a silence that echoes today in his refusal to respond to Sarah's claim. These choices, when stacked together, form a damning narrative, one not of direct murder, but of indirect responsibility. A form of emotional manslaughter, if such a thing existed in the moral court of public opinion. And perhaps that's what Lady Sarah is pointing to. Not a single act, but a pattern. A system of decisions made by Charles that, cumulatively, pushed Diana toward isolation and danger. In legal terms, it's not actionable. But in moral terms, it's devastating. Critics of Sarah's statement argue that grief can cloud judgment, that she is rewriting history through the lens of sorrow. But supporters counter that it's not grief speaking, it's rage. Controlled, refined, aristocratic rage. The kind of rage that simmers for years, then explodes only when the truth can no longer be denied. And then there is the question of why she didn't say it sooner. If Sarah truly believed Charles bore responsibility for Diana's death, why wait over 2 decades to say it? Why now? Some believe the timing is tied to Charles's coronation, that she sees his ascension as a final insult to Diana's memory. Others speculate that internal family tensions, perhaps something Harry revealed in private, prompted her to finally speak. There are rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that she had previously signed non-disclosure agreements linked to Diana's memorial fund or other royal charities, and that those agreements have recently expired. Regardless of the reason, the impact is the same. Sarah McCorquodale, the private sister, the loyal daughter, the silent mourner, has now become the loudest voice in a conversation the palace has worked for years to end. Her accusation may never result in a courtroom battle. But in the court of public opinion, it has reignited something long buried, not just the question of what happened to Diana, but the more dangerous question of who allowed it to happen. To understand the weight of Lady Sarah McCorquodale's accusation that her sister would still be alive if not for the choices made by King Charles, we must return to the final days of Princess Diana's life. These were not the days of royal engagements, state dinners, or tiara-clad appearances. These were the days after the palace had closed its doors to her, when the title, Her Royal Highness, had been stripped, when the institution had formally, if not emotionally, disowned her. Diana was, by all official definitions, no longer a member of the royal family. And yet, she remained its most powerful figure. In the summer of 1997, Diana was at once liberated and dangerously unprotected. She had re-entered public life with a fresh sense of purpose. She was making headlines not for scandal, but for action, visiting landmine victims in Angola and Bosnia, comforting children in orphanages, using her global celebrity to amplify causes no royal had dared to champion. But behind the cameras, something darker lingered. Those close to her say she was tired. Not just physically, but spiritually. Tired of the surveillance. Tired of the smears. Tired of the weight of being Diana. And, most importantly, tired of the fear. Diana had long believed she was being watched. Not by paparazzi, that was obvious and constant, but by the state. She confided in friends that her phone lines were tapped, her conversations monitored, her whereabouts tracked. Many dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of stress. But in light of later admissions by intelligence officials and private security operatives, many of her suspicions now seemed justified. In July of that year, she began spending time with Dodi Al-Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed. Their relationship moved quickly. Some described it as romantic escapism. Others believed it was a calculated defiance. Diana stepping outside royal expectations and openly embracing a Muslim partner, something which reportedly alarmed certain elements within the royal establishment. What's indisputable is that their relationship placed her back in the media's crosshairs. The press frenzy reignited. The paparazzi pursued her more aggressively than ever. In France, where press regulations were looser than in the UK, she was relentlessly hunted. But Diana didn't retreat. In fact, she seemed determined to live freely, as if daring those who sought to contain her. In the days leading up to August 31st, 1997, Diana and Dodi were vacationing on the French Riviera. They were photographed on a yacht, laughing, embracing, kissing. British tabloids ran the photos with gleeful hysteria. Rumors of an engagement began circulating, though close friends of Diana insist she had no plans to remarry so soon. According to those with her on the trip, Diana was in a contemplative mood. She was thinking about the future, not just personally, but philanthropically. She wanted to expand her work with anti-landmine initiatives. She was exploring launching her own foundation, independent from royal structures. She was seeking a base outside of Britain, perhaps in the United States. In short, she was carving out a life the monarchy could no longer control. And that, many believe, is what made her so dangerous. She was no longer a broken royal figure hiding in the shadows. She was becoming something far more powerful, a free woman with global influence and nothing left to lose. Friends say she was also deeply focused on her sons. She had just spent a summer holiday with William and Harry, and there were signs she was trying to establish a new normal for them, one not dictated by palace schedules. Diana reportedly spoke to friends about wanting the boys to spend more time outside of England. She even floated the idea of relocating to the US for a year and bringing the boys for extended visits. She knew this would provoke resistance from the palace, but she no longer cared. There are other, lesser-known details from those final days that now take on a chilling tone. Diana, according to one close friend, confided that she had received strange phone calls with no one on the other end. Her car's brakes had once failed inexplicably, leading her to suspect tampering. She reportedly carried a small notebook where she recorded every unusual interaction, every suspicious detail, a habit that dated back to her post-divorce isolation. And then there were the letters. In October 1996, nearly a year before her death, Diana reportedly wrote a letter to her butler, Paul Burrell. In it, she expressed fear that someone was planning an accident, a staged car crash, as a way to remove her. The letter was kept secret for years before being publicly revealed by Burrell during a legal battle. At the time, many dismissed it as melodrama. Now, in light of Sarah McCorquodale's recent comments, the contents of that letter have re-entered public discourse with terrifying new relevance. Diana's final weekend alive began in Paris. She and Dodi arrived at the Ritz Hotel, owned by his father, on August 30th. The plan had been to dine there and then return to a private apartment. But as paparazzi gathered outside in growing numbers, the plan changed. They decided to slip out the back entrance late at night in a black Mercedes S280 driven by Henri Paul, the hotel's deputy head of security. Here's where the facts begin to blur. According to French investigators, Henri Paul had alcohol and prescription drugs in his system, but CCTV footage shows him walking clearly and unaided through the hotel minutes before driving. Toxicology reports remain disputed. Diana and Dodi sat in the back seat. Neither was wearing a seatbelt. The car departed at high speed, tailed by a group of paparazzi on motorbikes. At 12:23 a.m., as they entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, the car struck a pillar. Dodi and Henri Paul were killed instantly. Diana was alive but critically injured. It took nearly 40 minutes for emergency personnel to extract her and transport her to the hospital. She died from internal bleeding at 4 a.m. Those are the official facts. But the inconsistencies have never sat well with many, including Lady Sarah. Why were Diana and Dodi allowed to leave without royal-level protection? Why was Henri Paul behind the wheel? Why did it take so long to extract her from the car, especially in a city like Paris with rapid emergency infrastructure? Why were CCTV cameras in the tunnel allegedly not working that night? Multiple investigations followed, one by French authorities, another by the British Metropolitan Police under Operation Paget. Both concluded that the crash was an accident. But many, including Mohammed Al-Fayed, never accepted those findings. Now, Sarah McCorquodale's statement breathes new life into those doubts. Because if she believes that Diana was failed, not by fate, but by deliberate choices, then those final days must be viewed not as random tragedy, but as a culmination of years of abandonment, of strategic isolation, of whispered campaigns to paint her as unstable, of pressure so intense it bordered on institutional gaslighting, of stripping away her royal security, of pushing her into a world where she was exposed, unprotected, and easy to follow. In the weeks before her death, Diana was on the verge of transformation. She was no longer begging to be let back into the fold. She was carving her own path, and in doing so, threatening to expose the very institution that had cast her aside. Whether or not that led to her death is still a matter of speculation, but it's no longer a fringe view. Now, with her sister speaking out, it is part of the mainstream conversation. And the final days of Diana's life, once treated as the sad conclusion to a tragic story, must now be reconsidered as part of something bigger. While the world reels from Lady Sarah McCorquodale's public statement about her sister's death, few realize that this is not the first time she has spoken, just the first time we've heard her. Behind palace gates and beyond public view, Sarah has been writing, documenting, and grieving in private. Letters, notes, voice recordings stored for safekeeping. She may not have stood at podiums or spoken to reporters, but her pen never stopped moving. Those close to her, house staff, friends, a handful of former aides, have described her as a meticulous recorder of truth. Not for revenge, not for fame, but because she believed someone, one day, would need to know. Now, those letters are beginning to surface. The existence of these private writings was first hinted at by a former employee of the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. According to this source, Sarah kept a personal archive related to her sister's life and death, including her own handwritten reflections. Most of these letters were addressed to no one in particular. Some were notes to herself. Some read like journal entries. Others were unsent messages to Diana, written after her death as a form of catharsis. But what makes these writings extraordinary is what they suggest about the extent of Sarah's awareness. One letter, dated late 2001, begins plainly. I have tried to hold it in. I have tried to trust that history would be kind to her. But the truth is, history is being edited, and silence feels like betrayal. This is a woman who had spent 4 years watching the world mourn Diana, watching the monarchy slowly reintegrate her into the narrative, just enough to appease public sorrow, but never enough to acknowledge the harm done. And for Sarah, that selective memory was intolerable. Several letters describe private moments between the sisters. One in particular, dated June 1997, just months before the crash, recalls a lunch they had in London. Diana reportedly told Sarah that she felt hunted and feared she wouldn't see another Christmas. She allegedly referenced an incident where she saw the same unmarked car following her on multiple occasions in different cities. Diana told Sarah, "They're not just the press anymore." At the time, Sarah wrote, "I told her she was being dramatic, but I remember feeling it too, that something was off, that she was being watched by someone who didn't belong." There are also entries expressing regret, for not believing her sister more fully, for trying to play peacemaker when she should have fought louder. One page reads simply, "She needed someone to shout," I whispered. Beyond Sarah's own words, other members of the Spencer family have also left behind testimonies, some public, some buried in private correspondence. Charles Spencer, Diana's younger brother, has spoken in veiled tones about the institutional coldness that followed his sister's death. In his now iconic eulogy at Diana's funeral, he took direct aim at the palace when he said she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic. It was a subtle rebuke, a hint of the rage beneath the surface. But what's now being revealed is that even Charles Spencer's eulogy was reportedly the result of internal family debate. Sarah, according to a family confidant, pushed for him to say more, to speak plainly, to say Diana was abandoned. She lost that argument, at least in 1997, but she never forgot it. There are other family notes that suggest Diana's fears were not isolated. A family friend remembers a dinner party at Althorpe House in 1996, where Diana confided in both Sarah and Jane Fellows about being followed. According to this friend, Sarah's demeanor changed sharply. She pressed Diana for details, asked questions, wrote things down afterward. It was the first time the friend saw fear in Sarah's eyes, not just sadness. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from a private letter allegedly sent by Sarah to a retired royal protection officer in 2003. In it, she requested information about a security decision made in the months after Diana's divorce, specifically regarding why her royal protection was revoked entirely. That letter, obtained through a leak, reads, "She was still the mother of the future king. You don't just sever ties like that. Someone made a call. Someone decided she was safer without you. I want to know who." The letter never received a formal reply, but according to insiders, it stirred quiet panic among certain circles in the royal security apparatus. It was the first time Sarah had reached out directly, and it suggested she was beginning to push back against the official record. Then there are the family recordings, rare, soft-spoken, deeply personal. In one, dated 2005 and reportedly part of a private oral history project for the Spencer family, Sarah says this: "Diana didn't die because of a drunk driver or a speeding car. Those were factors, but not the cause. She died because she was left exposed. They removed everything that could have kept her safe and let her be devoured. That wasn't fate. That was a decision." This line, once buried in an internal archive, now resonates with chilling clarity in light of her public statement. What emerges from all this is not just a portrait of a grieving sister, but of a woman who has spent decades living with suppressed outrage, collecting receipts, writing down details, refusing to forget. Sarah is not impulsive. She is methodical, and her decision to finally speak publicly suggests that she has been waiting for the right moment, or perhaps waiting until she could no longer stay silent without betraying her sister's memory. Those who have known Sarah describe her as stone and silk, emotionally composed, fiercely protective, a woman who plays the long game, which is why her sudden decision to break silence carries the force of a calculated move, not driven by headlines, but by a desire to correct the historical record. What's also notable is that none of these writings, recordings, or testimonies were ever leaked by Sarah herself. They were kept, stored, locked away. She never weaponized them for attention, never used them to challenge the crown until now. And now, one by one, they are coming to light. Some believe she always intended for this moment to come, that her silence was a form of strategy, buying time, gathering proof, waiting for the world to be ready to listen. Whether that's true or not, what's undeniable is that her private archives, her letters, her memories, her grief, are now becoming public history. And they may hold the missing pieces that have long eluded investigators, biographers, and conspiracy theorists alike. Because when someone that close, that quiet, and that meticulous begins to speak, the truth has nowhere left to hide. August 30th, 1997. Princess Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed arrive at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. It's supposed to be a quiet night, a return to Dodi's private apartment after dinner. But by the end of the evening, one of the most recognizable women in the world would be dead, and a global mystery would be born, one that, to this day, refuses to rest. We know the official story. Diana and Dodi left the Ritz around midnight in a black Mercedes S280, pursued by a cluster of paparazzi on motorbikes. Their driver, Henri Paul, the hotel's deputy head of security, had reportedly been drinking. He lost control of the vehicle inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The car struck the 13th pillar at high speed. Dodi and Henri Paul died instantly. Diana survived the impact but succumbed to her injuries a few hours later in the hospital. Only bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones lived, barely. That is the surface narrative. But Lady Sarah McCorquodale's recent accusation, suggesting that Diana's death was not merely a tragic accident, but the result of deliberate choices made by King Charles, compels us to look again. Not just at the moment of the crash, but at the entire chain of events that led to it. To do that, we must ask questions, uncomfortable ones, that have lingered for more than 2 decades. Why was Henri Paul behind the wheel? The man had no formal assignment as a chauffeur that night. He was the hotel's head of security, not a professional driver. According to hotel staff, he had been off duty earlier in the evening and only returned after Dodi requested privacy and a decoy operation to evade the paparazzi. Paul had allegedly consumed alcohol. Toxicology reports later indicated a blood alcohol level over the legal limit. But surveillance footage from the hotel lobby shows him walking normally, speaking clearly, and showing no obvious signs of impairment. Some experts argue the test results may have been skewed. Others suggest that his behavior was entirely inconsistent with someone who was legally intoxicated. In fact, one of the bodyguards present that night claimed Henri Paul appeared calm, alert, and focused, not the reckless figure painted by the press. Why was there no proper royal-level protection? By 1997, Diana had been stripped of her HRH title and no longer received protection from the Royalty and Diplomatic Protection Department. This meant she was responsible for her own security, a woman constantly pursued by paparazzi and watched by the world, effectively left to fend for herself. Why? She was still the mother of the future king, still a figure of immense national and international importance. Yet, despite this, she traveled without official protection. The French police were not notified in advance of her movements. There was no escort, no coordination with British security agencies. And according to reports, the backup security detail at the hotel was minimal. Why weren't Dodi and Diana wearing seatbelts? This is perhaps the most tragic and confounding detail of the night. Diana, by all accounts, was a habitual seatbelt wearer. In dozens of public photos, she is seen buckled in. Friends and former protection officers confirmed she was meticulous about safety in vehicles. Yet on this night, a night when the car was speeding, when they were trying to evade the press, when Diana had reportedly expressed concern about being followed, neither she nor Dodi wore seatbelts. Was it a lapse in judgment? A result of the chaotic exit? Or were the seatbelts not functioning? French investigators claimed the seatbelts were operable. But years later, Mohammed Al-Fayed funded a private investigation that claimed at least one rear seatbelt was faulty, possibly jammed, possibly tampered with. Why was it decided to transport Diana slowly instead of rapidly evacuating her to the hospital? French emergency medical services operate under a philosophy of stay and stabilize, preferring to treat patients at the scene rather than rush to a hospital. Diana reportedly remained conscious at the crash site. Her injuries, including a torn pulmonary vein, were internal and not immediately apparent. She was finally transported to the Petit-Salpêtrière hospital, but by then her condition had worsened. She went into cardiac arrest. Multiple attempts were made to revive her. At 4 a.m., she was declared dead. Medical professionals have debated this response for years. Could she have been saved with faster intervention? Would British emergency protocols have handled it differently? We'll never know. And then there's the CCTV, or rather, the lack of it. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel was, at the time, known to be monitored. Yet inexplicably, no footage from the crash itself has ever been released. French officials claimed the cameras were not functional. Others claimed the system wasn't recording at the time. No explanation was ever sufficient. It remains one of the greatest unanswered questions of the entire investigation. Mohammed Al-Fayed and other private investigators have argued that the CCTV blackout was not an accident, but a cover-up. Part of a coordinated effort to erase evidence. While this theory has never been proven, the void in the official record continues to fuel suspicion. What about the white Fiat Uno? Multiple eyewitnesses claim to have seen a small white Fiat Uno exit the tunnel shortly after the crash. Paint marks found on the wreckage of the Mercedes supported the presence of another vehicle. Yet the car and its driver were never identified. Police searched for years but never found the Fiat. The official report suggests the driver may have panicked and fled, unaware of the full consequences. But skeptics believe the Fiat was involved, either as part of a coordinated operation or a decoy to force the Mercedes into evasive maneuvers. Was Diana's death a tragic culmination of reckless pursuit, bad decisions, and unfortunate timing? Or was it, as Lady Sarah implies, the result of a system that made deliberate choices to expose her? It's important to revisit what Diana herself said just months before the crash. In a now infamous interview with journalist Martin Bashir, she spoke of being frightened by forces she couldn't name. She hinted at feeling watched. She said, cryptically, "There are powers at work in this country about which we have no knowledge." At the time, the comment was brushed aside as dramatic or paranoid. Now, it reads like a warning. Even more damning is the private note she reportedly wrote to Paul Burrell in 1996, predicting her death in a car accident. The note, kept secret for years, described a scenario in which her car would be tampered with and named individuals she believed were part of the plan. That note was dismissed by some as conspiracy-fueled anxiety. But with Lady Sarah's recent statement, it has re-entered public scrutiny. Because now, it's not just Diana's fears or Mohammed Al-Fayed's theories. Now it's coming from her own sister, someone who knew her best. Someone who was never known for public drama. Someone who has chosen this moment, decades later, to say something was wrong. So what really happened in that tunnel? Perhaps it was chaos. Perhaps it was tragedy. Or perhaps it was the result of a carefully calibrated series of decisions, denials of protection, stripping of title, social exile, that culminated in Diana being in that car, on that night, with no security, no backup, and no margin for error. And that raises one final, chilling question. If Lady Sarah believes someone is to blame, and she names King Charles as that person, then was that tunnel the scene of an accident, or the last chapter in a royal plan to remove a problem the crown could no longer contain? Every great mystery has its symbols. For the death of Princess Diana, three stand at the center: a man, a machine, and a void. Henri Paul, the black Mercedes S280, and the missing CCTV footage from the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. All three have been scrutinized, debated, dissected in forensic detail. Yet none have delivered the definitive answers that Lady Sarah McCorquodale and millions of others have long sought. If Diana's death was, as Sarah now implies, not merely tragic but avoidable, perhaps even engineered, then understanding what happened to these three elements is no longer a footnote in royal history. It's the key to unlocking the whole truth. Let's begin with Henri Paul. He was the acting head of security at the Ritz Hotel, owned by Mohammed Al-Fayed. Not a chauffeur, not a trained protection officer. A loyal employee, yes, but not someone who should have been behind the wheel that night, especially not in such a critical and volatile situation. Yet, on August 30th, 1997, Henri Paul was suddenly thrust into that role. The timeline, while technically clear, remains emotionally jarring. Earlier that evening, Paul had reportedly left work. Then he returned later, off-duty. After being contacted by Ritz staff, according to witness testimony, he was seen in the hotel bar, allegedly drinking. But then came the strange part. CCTV footage from inside the hotel shows him moving steadily, with no visible signs of impairment. He is seen walking with precision, talking to staff, entering and exiting elevators. Not once does he appear visibly drunk or disoriented. Despite this, French authorities claim toxicology reports showed his blood alcohol level was over 3 times the legal limit. They also stated he had traces of prescription antidepressants in his system. Here's where things begin to fragment. Several independent forensic experts, both during the original investigation and in subsequent reviews, questioned the results. How could a man so deeply impaired navigate the hotel with such ease? Some even suggested the toxicology samples may have been contaminated, mislabeled, or more darkly tampered with. Mohammed Al-Fayed insisted the results were manipulated to create a scapegoat, to frame Henri Paul as the reckless drunk who caused the crash, and by doing so, in the inquiry before it could ever begin. There's another element to Henri Paul that remains uncomfortably unaddressed: his alleged ties to intelligence services. According to documents uncovered in later investigations, Paul had substantial unexplained cash deposits in his bank accounts. More than £150,000, far above what he could have reasonably earned. French intelligence agencies denied any formal connection. But when questioned by Operation Paget, the British investigation launched in 2004, investigators could not conclusively determine the origin of his wealth. Was Henri Paul working as an informant? Was he under someone's influence? Was he aware of the magnitude of the task that night, or merely a pawn? Then there's the car. The black Mercedes-Benz W140 S-Class was, on paper, a reliable and secure vehicle. It was part of the Ritz's car service fleet, used frequently for VIP guests. But the specific car used that night, registration number 688 LTV75, had a history. The vehicle had been stolen months prior and recovered by police. It had also reportedly been involved in a previous accident and underwent substantial repairs. Its braking system, steering column, and seatbelt mechanisms had been serviced multiple times. Yet no formal record confirms a rigorous inspection before it was used to transport Diana. When the crash occurred, the front of the car was obliterated. The impact with the 13th pillar in the tunnel was devastating. But experts have raised concerns about the behavior of the vehicle in those final moments. The speed at which it was traveling, estimated between 60 and 65 miles per hour, was undeniably dangerous in an enclosed tunnel. But was that alone enough to destroy a car of that caliber so completely? And the seatbelts? Initial reports claimed they were functional. But later examinations found that the right rear seatbelt, where Diana sat, was jammed. It could not be pulled. If that's true, then she had no way to secure herself. It also raises a haunting possibility. Did she try? One former investigator revealed, off the record, that the belt's failure was known early in the French investigation, but was considered irrelevant to the final report. It was, according to him, classified as just another tragic detail. But it's not, because Diana was known for her meticulousness. She almost always wore a seatbelt. Those close to her confirmed it repeatedly. If the belt failed, it's not just tragic. It's suspicious. Was it damaged in the crash or before? And finally, the cameras. Perhaps the most disturbing and inexplicable part of the entire case. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel, a key roadway beneath Paris, had surveillance. That much is a fact. Yet somehow, in a city with robust urban monitoring, not a single frame of footage has ever surfaced showing the Mercedes entering, moving through, or crashing inside the tunnel. French police claimed the cameras were not functioning, but further investigation found that nearby cameras were operational. Some had captured images before and after the crash. Yet the critical stretch of road, the exact 100 meters where the impact occurred, remains a visual black hole. Why? One camera was said to be under maintenance. Another was not set to record. Others, according to investigators, did not face the tunnel. But eyewitnesses, including police officers on scene, claimed to see multiple cameras inside the tunnel, all pointing directly at traffic. So what happened to the footage? French officials have never provided a satisfying answer. The British inquest later concluded that the absence of footage was regrettable but inconclusive, a diplomatic phrase that means, we don't know, and we won't ask further. To this day, no security tape, no time-stamped still, no black-and-white traffic feed has ever emerged from inside that tunnel at the time of the crash. And for many, including Lady Sarah, that silence is not accidental. It is the most chilling detail of all. Because in an age where every corner of every city is monitored, the complete erasure of a high-profile crash involving the most photographed woman on Earth is statistically improbable, unless someone made sure of it. What do we make of all this? Individually, each detail can be rationalized. A drunk driver, a faulty seatbelt, a blind camera, but taken together, they form a pattern, a fog of doubt, a sequence of coincidences that no longer feels coincidental, especially now, with someone from Diana's inner circle suggesting these were not isolated failures, but connected failures. And worse, that they stemmed from choices made long before the car entered that tunnel. Henri Paul was chosen. The car was chosen. The route was chosen. The protection, or lack thereof, was chosen. And Diana? She wasn't given a choice at all. For Lady Sarah, these aren't questions of mechanics or traffic analysis. They are questions of intent. Who made the decisions that night? Who pulled protection from Diana's life so completely that she died without a bodyguard worthy of the title? Who created the conditions where a faulty vehicle, a questionable driver, and a blind tunnel were all that stood between her and survival? It's easy to call it conspiracy, harder to face it as consequence. But as more evidence surfaces, and as Lady Sarah breaks her silence, the line between the two is beginning to fade, and the shadows inside that tunnel are growing darker by the day. She was finally transported to the Piti-Salpêtrière hospital, but by then her condition had worsened. She went into cardiac arrest. Multiple attempts were made to revive her. At 4 a.m., she was declared dead. Medical professionals have debated this response for years. Could she have been saved with faster intervention? Would British emergency protocols have handled it differently? We'll never know. And then there's the CCTV, or rather, the lack of it. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel was, at the time, known to be monitored. Yet inexplicably, no footage from the crash itself has ever been released. French officials claimed the cameras were not functional. Others claimed the system wasn't recording at the time. No explanation was ever sufficient. It remains one of the greatest unanswered questions of the entire investigation. Mohammed Al-Fayed and other private investigators have argued that the CCTV blackout was not an accident, but a cover-up. Part of a coordinated effort to erase evidence. While this theory has never been proven, the void in the official record continues to fuel suspicion. What about the white Fiat Uno? Multiple eyewitnesses claim to have seen a small white Fiat Uno exit the tunnel shortly after the crash. Paint marks found on the wreckage of the Mercedes supported the presence of another vehicle. Yet the car and its driver were never identified. Police searched for years but never found the Fiat. The official report suggests the driver may have panicked and fled, unaware of the full consequences. But skeptics believe the Fiat was involved, either as part of a coordinated operation or a decoy to force the Mercedes into evasive maneuvers. Was Diana's death a tragic culmination of reckless pursuit, bad decisions, and unfortunate timing? Or was it, as Lady Sarah implies, the result of a system that made deliberate choices to expose her? It's important to revisit what Diana herself said just months before the crash. In a now infamous interview with journalist Martin Bashir, she spoke of being frightened by forces she couldn't name. She hinted at feeling